Tonight, we won't chase after lost alphabets or argue about which scholar guessed the right century. Instead, we'll stand beside a single circle of clay small enough to fit in your hand, patient enough to outlast your language. The air smells faintly of dust and olive oil. The room hums with the quiet machinery of memory. A lamp burns low. A brush lifts, trembles, and lowers again. And in that small movement, 3,000 years breathe in place. On the table lies the disc, a road that turns inward instead of forward, pressed with footprints that belong to no one alive. Each mark repeats like a heartbeat, learning its own rhythm, each symbol knowing just enough to refuse explanation. It isn't loud or grand or desperate to be known. It simply waits like wet earth holding the shape of a vanished hand. So lower the lights, let the clay warm under its lamp, and the spiral begin its slow rotation in your mind. And if old questions like this one steady your breathing, that's already enough to belong here. Somewhere in the storeroom, a brush pauses above the clay, not out of hesitation, but reverence. The air shifts just enough to move a shadow across the table, and the spiral catches light as if waking from a very long dream. A worker leans close. He doesn't know that the century will remember his hands, only that the clay must be firm, the marks clean, the fire steady. Outside, a kill exhales, slow and content. Inside, the disc turns quietly toward its first secret. In the storeroom, time reverts to shelf temperature. Wooden drawers breathe out the mild spice of old paper. A cotton string bows politely where it is tied around a gray box. When the lid opens, light does not pounce it, settles like a quiet cat choosing a lap. The disc looks smaller than the arguments it has caused, palm-sized, baked to a firm, warm color that pottery achieves when it has finally decided to become itself. The first impression is not mystery, it is tidiness. The spiral starts at the edge and winds inward with the manners of a well-brought-up road, keeping to its lane, never cutting corners. The impressions sit in a shallow riverbed of clay, each depression with little raised edges where the stamp once nuzzled and then withdrew. There is a rhythm to the distances, a patience in the spacing, and a steady avoidance of drama. It was a quiet afternoon, you can tell, perhaps with the sea far off breathing and a kill complaining gently like a kettle that refuses to boil. And someone in Phaistos decided to press a message into time. The workshop is present even now. If you tilt the disc, you see where the clay accepted more pressure at the beginning of the day and less after lunch, when wrists grow tired and the mind drifts to olives and errands. The edges show where a tool lifted and came back down, the faint rebounding of a springy hand. No one carved the signs. They were stamped tiny movable types before the printing press thought of itself. The little library of punches must have been tucked in a tray, each with its own personality, a helmeted head who always looks slightly surprised, a ship that barely remembers water, a lily that cares for symmetry at all costs, a shield that keeps rehearsing the same defense. The worker would lay down a sign, turn the disc by a fraction, lay another, then another, the way we click the same key 20 times and still marvel that letters line up. On one face, the sequence proceeds with composure. On the other, a few overlaps admit to human momentum, as though the hand hurried, then corrected itself with a small sigh. This was not a grand project. It was one day's work, serious but ordinary, like baking a loaf that happens to smell particularly good. We move closer, and the 45 little pictures arrange themselves for inspection. A feathered head, a running man, a fish that accepts being generic, a comb that refuses to learn your name, a plumed shield with the air of a bird trying to be a moon. They repeat with the obstinate politeness of rubber stamps at a post office, present in new combinations, never fussing about context. Some signs hitch together like syllables. Some lengthen as long as a healthy breath. Tiny vertical dividers mark clusters, the way an experienced baker scores bread, so it expands without making a scene. If you count, because counting is the first kindness of the sleepless, you find frequencies. One sign likes company, another keeps to the margins like an introvert at a symposium. If language is a city, this spiral has streetlights, but they illuminate no alphabet we can pronounce. The disc teases grammar and declines to name its country. Direction is a quiet problem. You can start at the rim and step inward, as if walking a garden path to the fountain, or you can stand at the center and spin outward with the confidence of spilled thread. The joins meet cleanly if you read clockwise. They mutter if you turn back. The eye tests both ways, like checking which side of a blanket is softer. Scholars have argued the direction for longer than the stamps themselves took to press. Meanwhile, the signs sit calm as chairs after a party. If this is text, there must be a voice we're missing, a reader who breathed at the right ticks, who knew where a sentence leaned and where it stood straight. If this is ritual, there must be a circle of listeners who already knew the tune, who could catch the refrain as it came round again, like neighbors finishing each other's proverbs. Either way, the spiral suggests a choreography. Begin, continue, stop, and then hold still at the center, like that moment when a spinning toy refuses to fall and then, deciding, falls politely. Theories drift in like evening moths, each attracted to a different lamp. A hymn, some say, because the repeated clusters look like refrains, and the rhythm of dividers feels like the measured exhale of a singer who has learned where not to faint. A calendar, say others, because you can map the segments to days or moons. If you are willing to occasionally stretch a week the way a traveler stretches a scarf to make it a blanket, an island itinerary, a ritual game, a magical instruction manual with an informal tone, a record of good ships and better gossip. My favorite theory explains fewer things than it discovers. It suggests the disc was a puzzle with no solution, designed by someone who liked the feeling of almost understanding. Each theory fits as long as it stays in a straight-back chair. Each wanders into trouble when it stands and tries to dance. Syllables scan nicely until they trip over a sign that refuses to be a vowel. Grammars align like well-behaved soldiers until a gap opens that no pronoun will cross. Prayers glow, but they skip the breaks. Good proposals leave the disc unharmed, and the mind slightly tidier, which is a considerate outcome for any evening. There is also the dignified business of suspicion. Could it be a fate? We try the polite tests first. Clay fabric says Bronze Age, not modern studio. The salts in the pores belong to soil that has not had coffee. The firing temperature sits in the range of old kilns that took their time and never bragged. Tool marks match a small set of stamps, some a little worn at the corners as if they had been tapped against actual clay and not a rehearsing mind. Under raking light, the overlaps look unplanned, therefore human. Laboratory thinking prefers corrections to performance, and the disc obliges. It wears its errors like freckles, not many, well-placed, difficult to imitate on purpose. Field notes, when we reread them, put the object where it does as it lay. The verdict refuses to be romantic, unlikely to be modern, unproven to be anything else, the way a cloud is unproven to be a ship or a sheep, even when everyone sees either. Science arrives with a whisper rather than a trumpet. A small dome of light travels across the surface, a raking beam that catches the tiniest relief. Shadows become sentences that a daytime lamp cannot read. Each sign rises fractionally. The helmeted head shows the soft rounding where a hand lifted the stamp, a miniature sunrise of clay. RTI reflectance transformation imaging, which is just a patient way of listening with light stacks photographs until the surface remembers what pressure felt like. Suddenly, a pause between two signs becomes an actual gap, not a wishful one, and you can almost hear the maker breathe. Chips that you would miss with your eyes at noon confess the moment of separation from the mold. They pin the making to an afternoon with weather. The spiral stops being flat and becomes a path with slopes. It is not talking exactly. It is letting you walk beside it. From here, hypotheses soften into bedtime shapes. If the disc is writing, someone once read it aloud at a pace you could have followed even while peeling fruit. They would have stopped at the little vertical ticks to let the line sit, then carried on with that calm energy a well-practiced reader brings to a text he has forgotten to worry about. If it is ritual, imagine a leader who traced the spiral while a circle answered in steps, repeating the clusters like familiar doorways. If it is neither, if the signs are a collection of fond ideas more than rules, then it is still a perfect object for thinking. The order is something you can hold. The meaning is something you cannot. That is the kind of problem that is agreeable at night. You do not need to solve it to enjoy its outline. The way staring at the ceiling allows you to appreciate how flat it is. The disc's spiral makes time visible. Start at the edge. The world, busy, well-lit, social. Move inward. The day slows. Details sharpen. Footsteps are measured. End at the center, a small calm dot where the clay rises slightly like the belly of a sleeping bird. You want to say the message settles there, but the disc refuses even this kindness. It meets you with clay and nothing else. A road inward, ending where the roads always end, at material, at the stuff that chooses to be only what it is. You can almost respect the stubbornness. It is what makes old pottery outlast the philosophies stacked on top of it. Someone, of course, stamped that last sign and lifted the punch, and then did not press again. That restraint has been admired for over a century. The worker could have squeezed in one more symbol, as we all do with our calendars when we add one more appointment to an already perfect Tuesday. They did not. They left a breath. It's the nicest editorial decision on the island. Our modern minds, used to margins filled with commentary and phone numbers, feel the silence and nod. We too wish to stop earlier than we usually do. There are micro-puzzles like crumbs along the path. One sign that looks like a plumed head is sometimes pressed a hair deeper than its neighbors, as though the punch sat newer or heavier in the tray. The ship appears slightly skewed in one run, as if the maker smiled and let a messy boat stand, the way people keep wonky mugs because tea tastes better in them. A pair of signs rub elbows where the clay was drier that hour, and their friction is recorded as a tiny ridge between them. At one point, a divider tick lands with just enough force to shave a curl of clay, which then accepted glazing in the kiln and reattached itself like a memory that was nearly lost. None of these prove a meaning. They simply prove a day. If you are still awake and there is no obligation here, consider how the spiral was planned. To stamp a road that tight without crossing your own tracks requires an easy geometry. You might lay a string and follow it. You might draw shallow guidelines, which low light could still reveal if we asked it kindly enough. The maker knew where the turn would be tight, where the curve needed to stretch. The spiral is therefore not a flourish. It's logistics, a gentle lesson. Most beautiful arrangements are basically schedules with better handwriting. Scholars keep a civil argument about the count of signs, whether the 45 we name are truly different or only wearing different hats. The helmeted head sometimes looks less helmeted. The shield sometimes pretends to be a cheese. A lily could be an insect when stamped sideways. It is a reminder that classification is a hobby very close to grammar. If we have the maker at a cafe table for 10 minutes, we would ask which ones were related and which were cousins invited just to be nice. The maker would shrug, perhaps, and say, "Those the same, those not," and sip. Later in the evening, the disc inspires the respectable kind of speculation that grows softer and truer the longer you sit with it. Maybe this was not made for strangers at all, but for a small group that already understood every sign by heart. In that case, it is less a text than a gentle cue sheet, the way a choir's program has only first lines and page numbers. Or perhaps it commemorated something already gone a performance. A procession, a prayer done properly once, so that those who remained could touch the pattern like touching a ring and remember the feel rather than the words. The disc, then, is a memory palace with only corridors, the rooms having been left on purpose at the next turning. People often ask whether the spiral unwinds like a story. I like to imagine the maker testing both possibilities, like someone checking which side of a pillow is cooler. Edge to center gives you the feeling of arriving. Center to edge gives you the feeling of going home. The maker chose or allowed us to choose, and that choice is almost the only freedom we get. All the rest is clay, stamps, technique, and the patience of a day when the weather was cooperative. If you map the intervals between dividers, some sections breathe a little longer, as if the reader hesitated there, or as if the ritual needed a wider step. Technical work can reconstruct the maker's rhythm. Faster runs where the punch fell like a heartbeat. Slower runs where attention sharpened, probably because a visitor had begun to talk, and the maker wished to be polite and listen without missing the clay. We can't identify the conversation, but we can point to where it started. It is one of the most humane discoveries archaeology sometimes grants. The spot in an artifact where a person was briefly distracted by another person and nobody minded. At some point in the analysis, you look up from the spiral and realize the room is working with the object. The lamps make a quiet ellipse on the table. The gloves are little domes of white like two couchant sheep. The pencil has rolled into the groove of a lined notebook and decided to nap there. The disc fits into this calm like a piece that had been missing, although of course it was never ours. We record measurements with elaborate care. We debate statistical confidence with the seriousness of accountants of air. We correct our own previous corrections and feel wiser. And the disc abides, neither helped nor harmed by our industry. It has almost no edges on which argument can catch. The last question people ask before giving up for the night is practical. What was it for? A very good question that receives, tonight, the most comfortable answer. It was for holding. For holding in the hand while someone explained something that, without the disc, would have seemed impolite to explain at length. The spiral gives anybody permission to take one more minute to finish a thought. When you reach the center, you could stop, and nobody would feel shortchanged. It is exactly the economy of bedtime. The sentence can be shorter because the blanket is already warm. We leave the disc face up, lamp low. The spiral remains a road that invites your eyes to stroll, all the way inward, until the clay decides that being clay is meaning enough. Somewhere out at the edge, waves repeat themselves without needing translation. On the table, the little pictures cease to pose and simply be. You might expect disappointment, but what arrives is quieter, the polite relief of not having to solve anything tonight. Breath finds its own dividers. The room dims by half a shade, then another. The disc holds steady at the exact same temperature as sleep. You might not expect a puddle of wax to keep respectable time, yet for a few quiet centuries, a soft, melting cylinder acted like a very polite clock. It did not tick, it exhaled. It did not chime, it sighed. By the width of soot on a wick and the pace of a droplet cooling into a tiny collar, people measured prayers, porridge, and when to stop talking. If you're still awake a little later, no pressure at all, you can subscribe, or simply imagine a candle nodding in agreement, and let the idea drift away like warm air near the ceiling. Candle time is forgiving. It almost insists on naps. First comes the bench-knotted wood, a shallow tray sprinkled with stray wick fibers like white commas, a clay pitcher of tallow that remembers last winter. The workshop smells faintly of sheep and kitchens. A boy turns the wicks on a frame. A woman pours, then pours again, building a cylinder the way you make patience, layer after layer, each hidden by the next. Monasteries ordered theirs by the dozen. Harbors ordered them by the score. Some cities kept candle weighers, serious people who knew that time was heavy when fresh and lighter as it worked. To make a timekeeper, the chandler measures not height but habit. The good wax falls at a known rate if the drafts keep their manners. The good wick drinks like a reliable guest steadily, without gossip. Along the side, the maker presses marks with a bone tool. Lines at finger widths, dots that look like constellations if you squint. Sometimes even tiny numerals for those who trusted arithmetic more than intuition. To see these marks by daylight is pleasant. To find them by lamplight feels like reading the palm of a friend. In some houses, the candle does not stand. It travels. A weight, often a nail or a bead of lead, is hidden inside so that, as the wax gives up its life at a predictable pace, the weight descends down the tube and tugs a string. The string turns a little drum with numbers around its rim, or rings a small bell that claims to be important and then apologizes for the noise. Elsewhere, the candle is simpler. It carries pins at agreed intervals. When the wax reaches a pin, the pin yields to gravity and taps the brass pan with a sound like a very small opinion. Members of certain guilds learned to hear their time. The metal said now, with such modesty that it felt rude to disagree. One account describes a scholar whose candle pins fell with such enthusiasm in a drafty room that his hour acquired a path but didn't. Deserve. He eventually moved the candle behind a book. The book enjoyed the responsibility. Reading candle time rewards attention over haste. The flame wears a little cap of blue at its base like an honest official. Above it, a tear-shaped dome of clear heat pulls shadows into friendly shapes. The candle's waist narrows and then resumes, making rings that look like years on a patient tree. If you have been given an official candle, the kind with trust baked into it, the distance between those rings matters. Some monasteries align the hours of matins and lauds to rings so familiar that a novice could find them in the dark simply by touch pushing his finger into soft wax like a child making a dimple in bread dough. This was not superstition. It was logistics. The rule was not when you feel holy, but when the ring meets your thumb. In a world where bells do the talking, the candle does the whispering. If the bell is public law, the candle is local custom. The candle traveler occasionally meets cousins. There's the float and needle clock. A hollow reed bearing a small lantern cap is set in a bowl of oil. A needle pricks the reed at measured bands. As the oil burns, the reed sinks, each prick passing a notch that clicks like a sleepy cricket. There is the hairline, a human hair, horsehair if you're practical, hair from a saint if you're optimistic, runs under the candle. At set moments, the wax softens the hair, which yields a reverse violin string that plays silence with persistence. And there is the rope of time that grandmothers kept for boiling eggs, a stubby fuse cut to 3 minutes, lit for breakfast and extinguished with a pinch that always felt gentle even when it wasn't. All of them teach the same small lesson, that time is mostly behavior and devices are ways to share it. Of course, candles misbehave. Air talks them into opinions. A north window that seemed innocent at noon grows ambitious by evening and persuades the flame to lean west like a pilgrim. The rate doubles, then halves, then returns to normal, like a friend telling a story out of order. A careful keeper sets up a screen, often a wooden leaf with a notch, the notch acting as a private horizon. In some records, you can almost see the compromise. A note says, "Allow 3 moments for the wind," which is not a moment in any court of law but proves serviceable in kitchens. In ships, where drafts are democratic and everything swings because the ocean remains undecided, a compass card candle appears. It sits inside a glass that spins on gimbals. The flame stays vertical, though moodier than on land, and a line of blackened glass shows how long the watch has been telling stories no one will write down. Scholars love evidence. Candles love to be lit. Between the two, you get a festival of footnotes. A Persian ordinance speaks of legal candles, sold by height and sworn to burn an inch per hour, which sounds official until you remember that inches change their minds between markets. A London account mentions wax tested by water. A measured stick is lowered into a pot at a simmer. The tallow melts away to a line, and some clerk says, "Yes, good, 11 prayers worth," a unit no one bothers to define. A handbook for travelers recommends a pocket candle with 3 pricked circles, one for walking, one for bargaining, one for apologizing when bargaining was too enthusiastic. I like the image of someone squinting at a tiny notch while deciding what their face should do next. It is an excellent use of technology. Candle clocks flutter along monastic pages. The rule expects hours to be sliced calmly, and candle marks provide the quiet knife. In winter, when the night is longer than patience, and the body forgets whether it is morning, the candle says kindly, "Not yet," and the cells resume the chorus of small noises that monastic buildings make stone cooling. A mouse correcting a plan. In some houses, the prior kept the official candle in a box with a glass lid, so that fidgeting brothers would not lend it their breath by standing too near. A later note scolds a certain Brother Martin for plucking the cold wax collars and rolling them into little balls while meditating. This is apparently not a step in any recognized devotions. Every age has its fidget toys. Commerce, for its part, turns wax to numbers. Shopkeepers close by candle ring. Taverns charge extra if the candle shows a neck, a well-known moment of evening because it means more stories than wine. Shipwrights in certain ports paid by the ring for planing planks, a practice efficient enough that it bred its own moral. Work goes safely when time melts where you can see it. A law court once timed pleas by a candle with 8 pins. The plaintiff got 4, the defendant 4, and the judge got the last stub to sigh over. This nearly guaranteed justice of a sort, the kind that ends. Then there is the problem of candles that are too clever. Trick candles are not a modern dessert. They lurk in medieval notes as the candle that refuses to decide. Mixed with bits of resin or salt, they sputter into temporary self-obliteration, then reignite with smugness. Great for pranks, disastrous for oaths. A charter from a small town that no longer exists describes an apology from a mayor whose oath, by this light, kept pausing as if the light itself were meditating on a clause. From then on, the town required beeswax for vows and tallow for dinner, and refused to let the two meet. This is how standards are born, from exasperation wearing a robe. If anyone wished to forge time, they had options. A heavy wick slows the burn. A thin one, trimmed too short, races like a rumor. Unscrupulous innkeepers shave the sides of marked candles to create honest faces with dishonest hearts. The way some people today rearrange their books so biographies look like novels. Clever litigants learned to breathe theatrically near someone else's candle when it was their turn to speak. The best defense remained boring. Place the candle in a glass away from lungs. Let the hour be drowsy and measurable. In experiments today, you can do this, though I wouldn't. To encourage you to lose sleep over it, an inch of good beeswax with a modest wick kept. Behind a tumbler strides through 60 minutes with the pride of a kitchen timer. It will not give you seconds. It will give you stew. Science strolls in late and unthreatening. A modern physicist with a fondness for thermostats can explain burn rate with charm. Radius squared needs oxygen with a handshake. The flame's foot is cooler than its head. Drafts are negotiations, not enemies. Set 2 identical candles under different bells and lift the lids by a finger width. 1 minute, 2, 3. The flame answers with more length than heat, or more heat than length. And you begin to see why monks wrote minute notes in margins while merchants shrugged and said, "Near enough." If you diagram the soot's growth on the glass, you get a story that looks like a sail filling, then relaxing, beautiful, unalarming. The graph never learned to hurry. At night, when the responsibility for time is soft enough to nap on, it is pleasant to imagine a house arranged around a single official candle. Supper sets itself by the first pin. The pot is lifted by the second. The third is for gossip that can be remembered in the morning. A child puts their thumb on a ring and asks, "How much?" And an aunt says, "This much," which is not an answer you can scarcity price. You notice how planning becomes gentler when your clock glows and vanishes instead of shouts and repeats. Candle time does not remind you of missed opportunities. It reminds you of warmth spent well. If you crave curiosity shaped like a small hook, just enough to keep attention from sliding off, consider the candle stub economy. The wax rolled from collars and trimmed from sides did not retire. It became fire starters, sealers of letters, polish for boots, balm for woodworkers' threads. In certain parishes, stubs from the church rack went to the poor by weight, which meant the poor acquired time along with light and humble thimblefuls. There is a record of a woman who saved stubs for 3 winters to make a single clock candle for a child's lessons. The note says the child learned quickly, possibly because each minute looked delicious and finite. Monks sometimes compared their candle to the water clock, and the water clock always answered with the same joke: "I don't blow out." But water sulks in frost and crowds in heat. It requires basins to be level and voices to be patient. The candle, by contrast, puts all its engineering in the wick and becomes portable. Carry it up a stair and your hour ascends with you. Set it in a window and your neighbors borrow the news of how late it is without eavesdropping. When storms arrive and roofs grow conversational, candle time keeps steady company by sounding like nothing at all. There were manuals, of course. Manuals are how we apologize for knowing tricks. They advise trimming wicks to the width of a barley straw and turning the candle a quarter each evening to defeat uneven habits. They suggest chalking the holder with a record of past honesty, 8 lines to the pin, someone writes. Then next month, 7 when cousin visited, which should not be admissible in court but is perfect for family dinners. One manuscript from Bologna proposes inscribing the names of saints beside the marks, thereby licensing the pious to measure without looking guilty about arithmetic. St. Lawrence, patron of cooks and comedians, occupies the moment when stew decides it will no longer be soup. This seems fair. Not all rooms liked candles behaving like rulers. In certain inns, artists paid for light not by the hour but by the flame. Each additional candle added a coin to the night, which created economics of shadow that students still admire. Painters learned to freeze hands and faces when the bell pin fell, then pick up the rest after dawn in the democracy of daylight. Candle clocks tempted them toward overtime. Landlords gently reminded them that time, like wax, was communal and expensive. Somewhere a ledger records 2 heads. 1 candle, which sounds less like stinginess and more like a recipe for friendship. Meanwhile, kings toyed with gadgetry. A prince in an unhappy century kept a clock candle inside a metal cage with a magnifying lens, so the melt could be seen but not interfered with. It did not make decisions better. It did make decisions slower, which is not the same, but sometimes pretends to be. Another lord had a candle connected to a chain, which dragged a small weight on an ivory scale marked with hunting scenes. When the weight struck a stag at the bottom, he went to bed. This is either the domestication of wildness or the wilding of bedtime. Historians are undecided and also sleepy. As for verification, the old problem of trust, we can reconstruct a respectable experiment with items in a drawer. You weigh a fresh beeswax cylinder, trim the wick to a thoughtful angle, slide 3 pins at 3 equal widths. You flip a jar into a shade, leave a thumb-width gap for air and light. You breathe elsewhere on purpose. The first pin falls with the authority of a tiny teacher. Note the time. The second hesitates at the rim and then relinquishes its place with a sound like a dot at the end of a sentence. Note again. The third, drunk on being last, clings a fraction longer and then relents. The 3 intervals will not be twins. They will be cousins with similar shoes. You will be pleased and also slightly hungry for bread. We have not talked about smell, which is memory's accomplice. Tallow means kitchens and thrift. Beeswax means churches and someone saving up. The hour scented with beeswax behaves better cleaner flame. Clearer glass, less muttering as it works, but both sorts reach the same education. You cannot look at a candle clock without considering uses, and uses are warm-blooded things. A city bylaw requiring shutters to be closed by the fourth ring does not imagine rebellion. It imagines children going to sleep while carpenters tidy their tools. The technology is small because the desires are gentle. By now you can feel a pattern, introduce a detail, walk around it twice, smile at it, return to the road. Candle time invites exactly that kind of walking. The marks up the side are little invitations to detour. What does this one mean? Why is it closer to the other? And then to drift back. If you crave a modern analogy soft enough not to wake anyone, think of the progress bar on a very patient download that refuses numbers and shows only a slowly filling line. Your mind fills the rest with kindness because you have decided to. What remains after all the footnotes and drafts and agreeable frauds is a bedtime hypothesis. Imagine laying one of these marked candles on its side in the corner of your room, inside a glass for manners, and striking it just as you settle. You choose a ring that means read 2 pages, another that means turn the pillow, a third that politely informs you that you meant to be asleep some time ago and are forgiven. There's no alarm at the end, only a small pool becoming itself. The light makes a lake on the ceiling. The wick goes on breathing without you, then, grateful for your lack of attention, begins to forget what it was doing. If you are still here, which is either impressive or charmingly indecisive, you might be wondering how candle time yielded to clock time. The answer is not betrayal but succession. When gears began to behave and springs discovered ethics, the candle did not protest. It moved to windowsills and altars and bath edges, places where time ought to be more like temperature felt than forgotten. It left behind a vocabulary of marks and a habit of dividing evenings without scolding. The last candle clock in a parish didn't retire. It went on illuminating a side aisle and pretending not to remember the law it once embodied. There is a final small fact that does not know where else to live, so let it live here. In a museum drawer, there exists a candle holder with a vertical ruler and a tiny clamp. Its label claims it is for scholars disputing at night to allot equal time by height. I like to picture 2 students turning the screw on the clamp, setting their candle to fairness, then forgetting to argue because the flame has persuaded them to watch instead. The device solves a problem? Yes. But mostly it demonstrates that even in debate we prefer a schedule that glows. And so the hour melts, not loudly, not all at once, but with a self-effacing competence. A ring thickens, then yields. A collar of cooled wax folds like linen. A pin remembers gravity and goes home. Somewhere a kitchen relents. A sentence decides it has ended. A city shutters one more window without annoyance. You could time all of this if you wished. You could write the numbers in a margin and be proud. Or you could let the candle own the evening, and when the light finally crouches and bows out, you could accept its apology for leaving you in the dark by already being asleep. You might not expect a clay circle to sound like anything, and yet if you sit with it long enough, your ears begin to invent a hush that fits the spiral perfectly. There is a storeroom at dusk, always dusk in these stories, where the dust hangs like patient punctuation. A palm-sized disc lies among ordinary sherds, as light as bread and just as undecorated until you lean closer. Someone does, with a brush that has learned to be quiet, and the bristles lift a thin nap of powder from a surface that is at once simple and deeply certain of itself. The lines are neat, as if a road had been pressed into wet earth by a careful traveler who stopped often, but never in the wrong place. The impression is handmade, yet identical again and again, like footprints that all share a shoe. The moment is so uneventful it becomes important. A notebook opens, a number appears, and a small artifact graduates from a piece of clay to question with a label. If you're still awake by the time, I start talking about spiral reading directions. You can subscribe or, in the spirit of the disc, simply circle back later. Truly, there is no rush. The object hasn't moved in 3.5 millennia. Evening deepens and the lamp warms the clay the way a hand warms a cat, that is pretending indifference. Under that stray glow, you notice that the signs on the disc are not carved, they are pressed. Each tiny picture, each miniature helmet and boat and lily and unknown bird rises from the clay as if a stamp met it, and they agreed to keep each other's company. The edges of each sign reveal a rhythm more patient than any pen. Lift, place, press, lift, place, press. On both faces, the spiral carries on, a polite procession that never collides with itself, and where impressions overlap. You can see where the tool landed and where it thought better of things and tried again. It looks less like writing than choreography. One day, it says, one worker, one kill enough time for this to be deliberate without being grand. In the corner of our minds, a tiny craftsman in a linen headcloth counts his stamps like a baker counting rolls, fumbles one, straightens it, and continues, because the clay is ready whether he is or not. If we had the set of stamps, the actual little library with handles darkened by hands, we could print this disc all afternoon like stationery. Somewhere, lost to damp walls and tidy cleanouts, a box once existed with 45 small pictures sitting in felt or straw, like an alphabet that refused to admit it was one. By the time the disc has been cataloged, the room has changed, and we change with it. There's a table where someone has laid a sheet of paper with a perfect little spiral drawn in pencil. The pencil line is like a low fence to keep our thoughts from sprinting. 45 symbols recur with calm, stubborn order. A plumed head nods, a shield leans. A lily opens every time without complaining about the clay's weather. Groups are divided by small ticks like a priest's breathing marks, showing where a voice might pause without needing anyone's permission. You count the clusters, longer ones that behave like lines of text, shorter ones that look like song. You count the individual signs too, because counting is what we do when meaning refuses to come over for tea. Some people see syllables, others hear whole words. A few with generous imagination stage directions. Minor theories hatch. The boat means journey, the helmet means a roll. The wheat-like thing means bread or not bread, depending on your optimism. Another scholar proposes that the arrangement is a hymn, and then immediately doubts the idea because the signs are so cheerful about repetition. A calendar appears like calendars do whenever humans face spirals. Someone draws a tiny stick figure next to the plumed head, purely to shake off the feeling of being watched by punctuation. Every time we think we've coaxed the pattern into saying something, it rewards us with a better silence. Then come the debates that fall asleep halfway through themselves. The spiral has an entrance and a finish line, but which is which depends on your reading habits. Do you start at the rim and walk inward like a guest who remembers to wipe their feet, or do you start at the center where the clay has a neat little seal, as if the story knows its final word first and is unspooling backwards to find out how it started? Read clockwise and the joins meet cleanly. Read the other way and the overlaps look like a pair of polite dancers apologizing to each other for being in the same hallway. Either way, the punctuation, those little separators that could be commas or could be fingernail marks, keep time. Like a drummer you trust but do not see. If this is text, we say it is missing a voice. If it is ritual, there is a missing room. Somewhere there is a person who knew exactly where to turn, who never once argued about the rim. We consult other spirals, the kind that live on shells and pot rims, and, if you are modern-minded, notebooks. We remember that spinning in and spinning out are cousins. We agree the disc is waiting for a reader who knows when to turn. Then we add, very quietly, that most reading is turning and not knowing, and the disc is in excellent company. Theories arrive with the night air and stack neatly, no two alike except in their desire not to be wrong. A game, someone says, a board game in two halves, each half a mirror that remembers differently. A list of island names sung on a voyage. Another voice suggests an itinerary with pictures for the crewmen who never learned letters but learned the sea. A hymn to a goddess whose cult was fond of lilas, unless they were wheat, in which case please transfer your attention to grain. A festival schedule, a version of who brings what to an event that only the island remembers. A Vinstock of syllables rehearsed by children who didn't know they were practicing archaeology for us. Each theory is beautiful until it touches a stubborn detail. The syllable counts fail to line up like chairs after a long dinner. The rhythm for the chant steps on the little breaks that act like paragraphing in clay. A calendar ignores the fact that the boat keeps showing up on rainy days, which calendars are good at, but also on sunny ones, which calendars resent. Good proposals fall neatly, leaving the disc undamaged and our minds a little tidier for trying. The spiral keeps its courtesy. It lets us test, then indicates where we guessed by giving us back our errors with good humor. The best compliment you can offer an unsolved thing is moderation. The disc receives it and answers with stillness. Because we are practical, we look for trickery. Modern forgery has a smell, usually of perfection, and the disc refuses to smell like that. Clay fabric belongs to its island. Basalts are from soil that remembers Bronze Age feet. Firing temperatures match the kind of kill that made bread taste faintly of terracotta, which is to say, normal. Tool marks belong to a set of stamps that show wear, not a studio kit with two clean edges. A lab places the disc under a lens that thinks like a patient crow, and the crow finds corrections, not performance. Lift, place, press. There is a hesitation where a hand corrected pace, a double press where someone's mind ran ahead and their fingers caught up later. Field notes put the object where the dust says it lay, and although field notes can sometimes be wishful thinking with dates, in this case the wishes are modest. The verdict stays careful, unlikely to be modern, unproven to be anything else. Meanwhile, the object looks the same as before, which is the nicest thing an object can do after a day spent in tests. Science, feeling useful but not bossy, draws its chair close and adds light. Raking light crosses the surface like sunrise that has opinions, revealing shallow ridges where the stamp touched and withdrew. Photogrammetry stacks images until the hand sequence reappears like a murmured instruction. Faster here, slower there, mind the edge. A pause between signs becomes visible as a tiny flat where the tool rested, a thought caught mid-press. Tiny chips at the periphery show where drying began, pinning the work to an afternoon that once had weather. A heat map appears of sorts, a polite fantasy based on relief and gloss, telling us which marks filled first and which were left for the end when the clay closed up like a sleepy eyelid. The disc does not speak, but its surface does remember being made, which is nearly as good in the company of people who like making things. Another scan, this one invented by someone who doesn't sleep much, gathers minute reflections into a composite. It looks like moonlight choosing favorites. The edges sing their small, repeated song. The spiral's road holds. We are learning, line by line, to ask it questions it can actually answer. Around now, and you can feel the room zipping its jacket against the chill. Bedtime hypotheses crowd in, because bedtime is where hypotheses live. If it is writing, we say, someone once read it aloud and paused at the ticks to breathe, and likely smiled in the same places every time. If it is ritual, a leader followed the spiral while a circle answered in steps. Left foot, then right foot, or maybe right foot, then left, because there are always two opinions about these things. If it is neither is in, If it is art and not pretending otherwise, then it is still a perfect device for thinking. Order you can hold, meaning you can't, and that has its own uses. People have stared at knotted carpets for centuries and learned patience without laws requiring it. We leave the disc on the table, lamp low, message intact, a road inward that ends where the clay decides, which is a place you can visit without arriving. In the morning of the second day that isn't actually the second day, someone tries to calculate how many pressings it would take to make the sequence seem. They count like cooks, not like mathematicians. Jars of signs, ladles of repeats, spices of rare ones that occur only twice as if to be coy. They conclude that an artisan with a good arm and a tolerant kill could do it between breakfast and the time the shade of the courtyard moved to the right-hand pillar. The time estimate is not binding. Another scholar pulls ribbon to measure spiral length and finds that the road would fit nicely around the circumference of a hat no one wears anymore. Trivia like this settles in the mind and makes it comfortable, like the way you keep the weight of a favorite mug in memory. The disc appreciates these efforts. It has been waiting a long time for harmless attention. Sometimes a spiral invites a story even when it does not want one. A visitor, having been warned to be sensible, still whispers that the symbols look like a theater cast list. The plumed head is a hero. The shield a chorus, the boat an exit, the lily a scene at dawn. This visitor then blushes and corrects themselves with a cough about epigraphy. Still the story lingers like the smell of olive smoke. A good artifact endures these narratives the way a seaside bench endures teenagers. The surface goes on being there. The grain improves with touching. In the margin of a catalog, someone has doodled the boat sailing in the opposite direction. The catalog survives. The doodler does too for a while. All of it adds up to a kind of community, modest, unorganized, loyal. There are small absurdities, as always, and they help. A journal notes that one of the signs resembles a frisbee, and then apologizes. Another says the plumed head could be a pastry if rotated, which is how philology becomes hungry. A museum guard over years learns exactly how much to tilt the lamp so the spiral looks alive to school groups and writes the angle down secretly on a scrap of paper. 7 degrees give or take opinions. There is a persistent rumor that holding your breath while tracing the spiral increases insight, a practice that produces only lightheadedness and a newfound respect for punctuation. Humor is a solvent for overconfidence. The disc appreciates it. When the object travels to a different display, it remains as motionless as ever, and yet the light shifts enough to reveal new politenesses. What we took for bluntness becomes economy. What we thought was haste turns into a gesture repeated, because repetition is how craft remembers itself. A curator with the calm of a librarian decides to place the disc beside other spiral-minded things. A shell that looks like a staircase designed by a minimalist to pot rim, where the painter wandered and corrected himself the way you erase pencil with your thumb. A child's toy that no one can prove is not a cosmology. The case becomes a small argument for slow observation. Visitors lean in. One laughs when they realize the spiral reads like the route you take to avoid stepping on a sleeping cat. The cat, being imaginary, remains asleep. It is worth mentioning the hands that have turned the disc-gloved hands with touch that is more listening than contact. They do not push or pry. They swivel the object like a planet visited by a well-mannered probe. Their notes are not large. Slight microchip at outer ring, not new, reads one. Central boss glossy with age, reads another, which sounds almost judgmental until you recall that gloss is time's way of shaking hands. If the disc were sat on a kitchen table that would ask for a coaster and a story, both would be supplied. Neither would make it talk. I cannot prove this, but I like to think the stamps made a noise when pressed, something like the soft-syllable clay says when it gives way and then decides not to care. The worker would have listened the way bakers listen for bread that thumps hollow. At the end of the day, the stamps would be rinsed in a basin, their faces higher now from the attention, their edges darker. Someone would line them up to dry, 45 little arguments all facing the same direction, all ready to begin again tomorrow and end again in that small, neat boss at the center that looks so much like a period you can hear. The kill would warm, the courtyard would cool, and the disc would become itself slowly, which is the safest way to become anything. If a modern gadget wanted to imitate this object, it would do so with LEDs and a mechanical sigh. It would load symbols on a carousel. You would press a button that claims to be red, and a voice would intone syllables in 3 languages with equal uncertainty. You would return it after a week because it did not argue back. The disc keeps its place without batteries, which makes it better than most of our devices at being patient. In the same way, a spiral notebook outlasts the app that tries to replace it by letting your hand decide how much your thoughts weigh. Old technologies are not quaint. They are survivals from experiments that remained useful. By the 4th or 5th consideration of the same surface, you start a little habit of your own. You pause at the ticks as though breathing along with someone distant. You turn the image with your thumb as if the clay still warms under a lamp the shape of a half moon. The spiral grows familiar, like a friend's hallway that you could walk in the dark without knocking over the table where the keys live. It never resolves into a paragraph, and somehow that is restful. We are not waiting for a plot. We are visiting a pace. There will be papers tomorrow that repeat what we already know with inventive caution, and another tomorrow after that. Each will add a millimeter of certainty or a milligram of doubt, and the disc will accept both with the same expression. A good archive earns its dust. A good mystery earns its sweeping. If you fall asleep while imagining a tiny wooden stamp landing again and again in wet clay, do not worry about missing the conclusion. It does not end. It settles. The road inward turns once more, the center waits without urgency, and the lamp gives off that very small sound that all lamps give off when they realize they are the most interesting thing in the room only because the room is kind. You might not expect a circle of baked mud to be so confident about where it is going, and yet this one begins to lead the moment you notice it. The storeroom is quiet in the way late afternoon is quiet when a window is open just enough to let dust pretend it is weather. A soft brush lifts a little cloud from the shelves, and in the clearing, a palm-sized disc turns up almost by accident. It lies among ordinary sherds like a coin that never had to buy anything. Nothing dramatic happens. A lamp is set nearer, the kind that hums politely, and the clay warms as if remembering the kill that finished its first day's work. Someone leans closer and sees a road on the surface, neat, obedient lines pressed into a spiral, not cut, not scratched, but pressed, as though a traveler with small square shoes walked steadily across wet earth. The signs look handmade and still identical, like footprints that all share a boot borrowed from a friend. A notebook is opened because notebooks are what stand between a find and a forgetting. A number is written, a shelf is assigned, and a quiet artifact graduates to being a question. If you are somehow still alert by the time I reach the part about the reading direction, feel free to subscribe, or just let the idea circle you and settle later. The disc certainly did. The longer the lamp warms it, the more the surface reveals its manners. You can tell it was not carved. Each tiny picture rises from the clay with the soft, rounded shoulders of an impression. A helmet, a feathered head, a boat too tidy for bad weather, a lily that refuses to wilt even after 35 centuries. Each appears again and again with the regularity of a person who always arrives 5 minutes early. The edges of the impressions show lift and landmarks, the rhythm of a hand that learned patience by repetition. If you trace a finger a safe distance above the spiral, you can feel where the tool paused, where the artisan corrected pace, where the clay asked for a moment and got it. Both sides carry the same promenade. On one, the stamping is slightly more certain, as if the worker had warmed up. On the other, a few overlaps confess that even habit has to breathe. This was a day's work in stamps, not a week's meditation with a stylus. Imagine a shallow basket of little blocks, each with a handle, each with a face carved into a sign, set out on the workbench like cookies cooling. Somewhere there must have been a wooden tray with 45 compartments, one for each small picture, and a few spares because workshops know about loss. A person with a steady wrist and an ordinary need to finish before the courtyard dropped into shade pressed them in sequence. Lift, set, press, breathe. Lift, set, press, breathe. It is difficult to fall asleep while counting sheep. It is much easier to do so while counting stamps. By evening, names begin to be invented for what we see. We are good at that. The 45 little pictures receive gentle labels until the labels feel older than the clay. A plumed head looks this way every time. A shield leans that way every time. The boat sails perpetually without a harbor. And some plant like signweed or lily or absolute botanical mystery opens responsibly on schedule. Groups of signs are separated by slim notches that behave like commas drawn by someone who likes tidy margins. Longer clusters sprawl like lines of text. Shorter bursts sit like refrains waiting for a chorus that will never arrive. People who hear language in everything begin to count. Some think they see syllables. Others swear they hear whole words spoken by a dialect that still keeps it silent. The more cautious admit they only see a grammar of recurrent shapes and pauses, which is a kind of meaning even if it never picks up a pen. The pattern invites theories the way a warm kitchen invites neighbors. The disc promises that it can be read, then refuses to say which language it practiced for. The result is charmingly inevitable. We read it as ourselves. Reading, of course, has to start somewhere, and a spiral is no great help about beginnings. There is an argument that shows up early and refuses to go home. Do you start at the rim and walk inward as if entering a town with increasingly narrow streets? Or do you stand bravely at the center where the clay ends in a small confident boss and spiral outward like a sentence that finds its voice as it goes? Clockwise makes the joins meet cleanly. The little separators nod in approval, and you feel clever the way you feel after stacking bowls by size. Counterclockwise gives you a few disagreeable overlaps that look like a pair of dancers apologizing to each other. Back and forth experiments are conducted, complete with pencil spirals on paper coasters. No one wins. The best thing to say is the gentlest. Either direction makes a kind of sense. But the disc is a patient thing and seems to be waiting for a reader who already knows when to turn. It keeps its secret without gloating. If this is text, it is missing a voice. If it is ritual, there is a missing room. If it is neither, it remains a very fine way to show that order can be held in the hand, even when meaning chooses not to attend. Meanwhile, the beautiful ideas arrive carrying small fractures, which is the usual exchange rate. The first is hymn. A hymn can survive a lot of vagueness if the pauses cooperate. Here they almost do, the ticks behave like breathing marks, and the repetition of symbols feels like refrain, but then the syllables fall out of step the way museum visitors do when the guide unexpectedly stops. Next comes calendar, because all spirals eventually tempt someone to talk about the sun. Days and months line up convincingly until the boat insists on appearing on days that are obviously not nautical. An island list sails in at once. The ships, the ports, the words for favorable wind that are all secretly the same word. It works until the counts fail to fit like lids on jars borrowed from 3 different households. A game follows because a board and 2 faces is irresistible. The rules are admired for their elegance right up until you try to play around and realize you don't know how to win or end. Pilgrim track, festival schedule, catalog of offerings, even a tiny script for a tiny stage. Each theory finds purchase like a foot on a stair, then knocks into a step you didn't see. The pleasure of this is underrated. A neat proposal collapses politely and leaves the object exactly as it was. We tidy up, having learned where our assumptions were taking a nap. Because we worry about being fooled, we test for forgery with the timid zeal of people who want to be convinced but not tricked. The clay fabric matches its island rather than a modern studio. The salts embedded in it are the sort that creep into everything when centuries pass, not the sort that arrive in a hurry. The firing suits a kill that once did honest work for bowls and bread tiles. Tool marks agree with a kit of stamps used long enough to round their edges. The kind of wear that would be a nightmare to fade convincingly without accidentally inventing Renaissance patina instead. Under raking light, the impressions show little hesitations and second tries, and the hands behind those hesitations would be difficult to impersonate without a time machine and a willingness to sweat in a courtyard. Field notes, those modest diaries of dust and guesswork, but the object where excavation says it lay. We practice moderation and the disc rewards it. Unlikely to be modern. Unproven to be any particular Bronze Age confession. That is not a headline. It is better. It is permission to keep sitting with it. Science, when it remembers to be gentle, is the best kind of company for an insomniac artifact. Light is tilted until it behaves like sunrise choosing favorites. Shallow ridges appear where stamps came down and came away. The shadows tell you the direction of a hand that never pictured you. Photometry stacks images into a kind of soft relief that the eye can walk without stumbling. The gaps between signs, not voids, just pauses turn into small horizontal flats where thought rested. They look like little benches, and once seen, they are hard to unsee. Chips on the outer ring reveal drying along the edges first, which is what clay does when the afternoon forgets to be cool. If you are fond of maps, you can picture a heat map of attention. Certain signs pressed earlier when the clay was generous, others left until later when the surface had grown stubborn and required a firmer certainty of meaning. None of this translates the message. All of it anchors the making, which may be the more durable thing to know. A quiet if floats into the room. If the stamping cadence is recoverable, then we can rehearse it with our own hands. Not to imitate, only to understand. In that rehearsal, the mind quiets as bodies do when they relearn an old motion. It is a permissible kind of time travel. By now, you may be wondering who used the thing, which is the sort of question a museum label kindly discourages by narrowing the possibilities. The disc avoids biography completely. No names, no portraits, no scribal flourish in the corner that says, "Made by S." This forces us into comfortable speculation. A workshop with enough daylight to invite shadows. A low table like a tray used for bread if the bread were flat, with a cushion for the stamps so they would not bruise their faces. The artisan, not young and not old, but old enough to have learned rhythm, young enough to stamp an entire afternoon without asking for water twice. Perhaps there was a helper who returned the right stamp to its bin, like a child helping an adult cook and misplacing the spoon just often enough to be remembered. It is as specific and as pointless as counting stairs you cannot climb. Somehow it helps. There are small absurdities at the edges, and they behave like nightlights. One scholar measures the length of the spiral with string, and then straightens the string and discovers it would wrap once around a modern hat brim, a fact that refuses to matter and therefore becomes pleasant. Another rotates the plumed head and decides it could be a pastry with confidence issues. Corrections follow in the next footnote. A curator keeps a secret about the lamp. 7 degrees of tilt makes the impressions look as if they are thinking. This is not science. It is hospitality. A guard who has taught 1,000 school groups to breathe when they lean in invents the rule that everyone must trace the spiral with their eyes and not their fingers. The rule works half the time, which is astonishing for any rule that involves children or adults, or both. If we let the artifact be lyric for a moment, only a moment, we promise it becomes a bedtime kind of apparatus. The spiral can be walked with thought the way you walk a block and forget you did. Start at the rim and you are entering. Start at the center and you are opening. Either way you turn, the ticks give you a place to inhale. The repetition of pictures produces that background staticky comfort of a ceiling fan someone sat long ago. Your mind begins to insert tiny stories it doesn't believe. The boat is always leaving. The shield is always waiting. The lily opens every time in the hope that this time someone will smell it. You smile at yourself without moving your mouth and return to the pace of pressing stamps, a pace you never learned and now somehow remember. This is the odd gift of a message that will not declare itself. It permits you to practice attention without consequence. Of course, the theories will return tomorrow. Someone will attempt a syllabary with heroic stubbornness and convincing examples until example 12 behaves badly. Someone else will announce that the signs correspond to a ritual inventory. Item plus number, and you will nod until the numbers act like adjectives instead. Forgery will briefly raise its head like a cat that wants to be fed at inconvenient hours, and then lie down again when reminded about soil salts and old fire. A new scan will produce a new contour map that looks like topography and therefore suggests hiking. And a new article will make a respectful case for reading from the middle outward, while admitting that the inward path is equally tempting like two equally friendly doorways to the same quiet room. The disc will take these offerings and stack them with the rest like folded linens no one is in a hurry to use. What remains is the small certainty that someone solved something once not the message, but the problem of putting a lot of meaning on little clay quickly and beautifully. A stamp set is an alphabet that never confessed it was one. The spiral is a page that keeps its margins without scolding you. The day of work it records was long enough to be memorable and short enough to be ordinary. There is comfort in that proportion. It is the proportion of a walk taken before dinner, of bread that finishes exactly when the conversation does, of a line of verse that sounds complete, even if you never know what the poet meant. We can leave the disc face up under a modest lamp, and it will continue to be exactly itself while you drift. The room becomes a portico of small sounds, the brush returning to its drawer, a pencil setting itself down with an air of finality it does not deserve, the faintest tick from the lamp's metal shade cooling. The spiral holds the light the way a path holds footprints from a day when the sand was damp and obedient. It is not close. It simply stops with that centered boss that pretends to be a period and is really only a pause taken seriously. If your eyelids imitate the lids of old boxes and settle, the disc will not mind. The road inward remains. The stamps keep their rhythm. The 45 little pictures watch over the rest of the room's breathing. In the last conscious inch before sleep, you may think you hear the tiniest sound a wooden stamp makes when it meets wet clay and decides to stay long enough to leave. That too is a kind of reading, and it is enough. You might not expect a law about bread to tuck you in, but the medieval assize of bread and ale is exactly that kind of blanket woolly, a little scratchy and warm in all the right, unremarkable places. The day begins in an English market that smells like smoke and dough. A bell rings with the particular confidence of a bell that has rung every market, day since bells discovered they could be political. A clerk unrolls a narrow sheet, its ink slightly shiny where it never dried properly, and reads the numbers in a voice that makes numbers feel older than they are. The assize is simple on paper and gloriously fussy in practice. Bread must be sold at a weight that changes with the price of grain. When wheat is costly, loaves get smaller. When harvests are kind, they grow again like a town's pride on a feast day. No drama, only arithmetic that keeps its hat on indoors. The idea is practical. The poor should pay the same coin for the same loaf named farthing. Halfpenny, penny no matter what the fields decide. A quiet heroism, like fixing a door latch so it clicks without waking the house. If you find yourself awake a little later, somewhere between flower grades and fines, You can subscribe to more of this gentle policy talk or not. I will never know, and the bakers will keep kneading either way. The clerk speaks of measures with the tenderness of someone who has counted barley corns and lived to tell it. A farthing loaf is not a kind of bread so much as a promise disguised as crust. The promise has a weight, and the weight takes orders from the month's wheat price, which takes orders from weather, ships, rodents, and the long conversation between millers and wind. The table is long. It says things like, if a quarter of wheat costs this many shillings, the penny loaf shall weigh this many ounces, and also perhaps a little more, because bakers are human and scales are sentimental. The numbers climb and fall the way staircases do when you carry a basket. The clerk reads them without blinking, and in the small pauses, a rumor slides through the crowd that the ale tasters have insisted on tasting again. They always do. Their job is to sip and to nod and to frown when a brew stretches its honesty with too much water. It is a public office with private perks. You can imagine the badge, 2 crossed spoons and an afternoon off. The assize requires marks. Bakers must place signs on their loaves, which is both accountability and advertising. You can picture a tray cooling under a window where sunlight practices being valuable. On each round loaf is a stamp, a small crest, a letter, a symbol that means Thomas across from the smithy or the widow's oven of the lane's bend. The marks make loaves legible in a way that ears recognize first and eyes admit later. If a loaf is light, the mark is heavy with blame, and the pillory waits with its bored wooden gaze. Punishment is public and dull on purpose. Being pelted with stale bread is not recorded, though it is often imagined, perhaps because the image fits so well in a quiet theater of medieval fairness. The reality is more mundane. A fine, a lecture from someone who has never baked, and a note in a roll that will outlive everyone present. The rolls are worth lingering on. They are long lists in Latin that reads like someone blessing each detail with the patience of a winter day. In the market of such and such, on the feast of so and so, these bakers were immersed for bread of insufficient weight, followed by sums that look both small and stern. An entire page may be the financial diary of crumbs. Inspectors carry balances that swing like polite metronomes. One pan holds a loaf. The other holds a little stack of standardized weights that have names like angels and avoirdupois, names that are delightful to say aloud and irrelevant to falling asleep, which is ideal. When the loaf is honest, both pans agree to hover. When it is not, the weights make their point with the relief of gravity doing its job. Nothing crashes. There is no gavel, only the soft, almost there click of equilibrium deciding it will not be full today. The assize speaks, too, of the oven, which is a neighborhood more than a machine. Ovens are expensive, communal, and scheduled like small moons. Families bring their shaped dough on boards, each marked with a notch or a pattern, so the baker can return the right bread to the right house. An afternoon can be mapped by the smell of permissions. First comes the bread that needs a bold heat, then the bread that prefers a patient one, then pans of pottage to thicken, then trays of apples to turn into a dessert the law does not measure. At the end, the oven cools with the satisfaction of old brick. In this cycle, the assize is the quiet uncle who checks his watch and asks if everything is in order. And it usually is, because dinner does not wait for policy. And policy is happiest when it is allowed to be background. There are microdramas gently staged. A miller arrives late with flour that clumps like gossip. A baker tests it with a pinch and adjusts the water with the confidence of someone who can correct for rain just by looking. An apprentice drops a weight and spends an hour polishing it with a cloth until his reflection admits the mistake is forgiven. A woman brings coins wrapped in a twist of cloth that once held time and now smells like currency that lived a better life. She asks for yesterday's bread, cheaper because time has pressed it a little. The law approves of this transaction in a silence that feels like wisdom. Yesterday's bread is halfway to pudding, custard, toast, soup names that do not require the assize to bless them. Even economies have leftovers, and they are often delicious. The ale side of the story flows in the background with the contentment of gravity. Ale is not beer. Hops have not yet auditioned for the role of bitterness. It is grain persuaded into pleasantness. The assize insists that it be sold by a measure that is the same in all places, which is mostly true, and never entirely. An ale cunner, which is a title that sounds like a riddle but is only a job, checks the measure with the caution of a person who has seen vessels grow a little in the retelling. There is a folk tale that the cunner sits in a puddle of ale spread on a bench to test stickiness with his leather breeches, the medieval version of the soft drink spill test. And while historians tug at their collars about this, it remains too charming to evict. The more likely test uses eyes, noses, and an honest cup. Prices are posted, sometimes chalked, sometimes declared. And a pot of ales is regulated as a sermon is regular, the same shape, the same length, the same comfort unless something has gone noticeably off. Numbers return like old friends who never tire of being introduced. The penny loaf, the halfpenny, the farthing. Ounces that look different depending on which county taught you to count. Quarters of grain that are not a quarter of anything you meet in a modern kitchen. The tables in the assize are staircases again. If wheat is 12 shillings the quarter, weight is this. If 14, it is that. If 16, it is still respectable. Bakers learn the table the way singers learn a chorus line. They can hum it while meeting. When grain prices are kind, loaves become generous in a way that feels like a town smiling. Children notice. Slices cut thicker. Stew acquires a partner. The poor see policy working as intended, which is a rare and modest happiness. Like a shoe that fits on the first try, enforcement is designed to be visible but not exciting. Wardens walk with weights in small leather bags that look like medicine for scales. They stop by stalls and nod. They weigh when weighing feels warranted. They make notes in a hand that never hurries because hurrying confuses numbers. Fines collected by lamps for the guild hall or pay the fee of the clerk who writes the next roll. If a baker offends again, the pillory appears, and everyone remembers that bread is easy to love and even easier to judge. The point is not cruelty, but calibration. A baker who is publicly corrected becomes, for a season, the most careful measurer in town. Loaves from that oven are exemplary for months, and customers remark on it with a satisfaction that sounds like forgiveness disguised as praise. There is always a scale. On a windowsill somewhere, the weights are small, round, and various, engraved with crowns or letters, evidence that a central authority once cared very precisely about how heavy small round things should be. The smallest weight can be lost in a fold of cloth. It will turn up in spring under a chair with a characteristically innocent gleam. Children find them and pretend they are coins from a kingdom where buying and weighing are the same verb. In a sense, they are not wrong. The baker's balance learns a personality. One arm droops when it has been a damp week. The little pointer at the top, meant to align with the tiny line in moments of justice, likes to hover just a whisper off, as if it has opinions about gravity, the way cats have opinions about lap schedules, recipe habits, subtle in layers no law ever wrote. Bakers save bits of yesterday's dough as the mother of tomorrow's. The piece has a name in every language. Each name means this has worked for a long time. The assize never objects to tradition unless it becomes a trick. Tricks are the small cheats of survival. A handful of bran left in, a loaf of shade underweight in the hope that shade is policy enough. Inspectors learn to see the shade. Most days they let it pass because a shade keeps neighbors neighborly. On feast eves, though, everyone is strict. Prices are posted in larger numbers. Weights are checked after sunset by candle, a dramatic act that somehow produces fewer arguments than daylight. Anecdotes creep in with slippered feet. In one town, an old measure disappears the morning of market and reappears inside a well bucket that afternoon. The culprit is water who wanted to be counted. In another, the baker's mark is a little bird because he once kept a chatty sparrow on the shelf over the kneading board, and customers insisted they could taste his conversation. One day, the bird falls silent and the loaves come out indifferent. The baker adds a pinch of anise, and the town agrees that the sparrow has returned. None of this appears in the rolls. The rolls prefer sums, but the human details hum along the margins like bees deciding which flower deserves minutes and which deserves hours. If you are wondering how people remembered all this without spreadsheets, the answer is that they did, and they wrote down what memory forgot, and the two together were enough. A guild elder could recite weights for 3 price points, the way a musician can find 3 keys with the same song. A housekeeper knew how many ladles of ale filled a family's best jug, which was the only test that mattered on a wet night. Children counted farthings with their bread and learned fractions before they met a school. The assize sat behind these habits like a mild ancestor on a chair by the fire, occasionally clearing its throat to remind everyone that the penny is not a theory. Sometimes the assize failed, and the failure is instructive in a soft, teachable way. A harvest goes wrong in 3 consecutive counties. Grain climbs the table until the numbers look like steps up a tower that disappears into cloud. Loaves shrink to honest coins with crust. People complain, then stop, because hunger tires even speech. In that season, ale matters more. It is bread that forgot to be solid, and it carries people until soup remembers itself. Afterward, the law returns to its old confidence as if nothing happened. It is one of policy's secret talents. It looks sturdy by surviving weather rather than by preventing it. We can follow a loaf from flour to crumb like a pilgrim on a small, devout journey. Flour falls in a patient snow. Salt joins it like gossip that finally turned useful. Water completes the congregation. Kneading is quiet labor that turns time into gluten without looking at a clock. The dough rises under claws that have known better mornings. A hand presses 2 fingers in and listens with fingertips. The oven, already humming with other people's meals, accepts the new arrivals. Bread darkens and speaks in tiny crackles. When it is done, a peel slides under with the elegance of practiced theft. The baker taps the bottom of one loaf and hears a hollow thud that means now. He stamps the crust with his mark. The mark meets law in a little handshake. There is something very calming about the part. A legal system plays in the sound of a tapped loaf. Night makes accountants of everyone. The baker counts coins, weighs a few loaves to check himself, and writes a small note to tell tomorrow what today learned of less water if the flour holds grudges, more time if the air is in a mood. The alewife wipes her measure with a cloth that knows the shape of the cup better than anyone. She hangs the cloth on a nail and tells it she will explain tomorrow's price when tomorrow is less personal. A warden folds the roll, blows out a candle with a sigh that suggests paper and flame have finally agreed for once. The town exhales through shutters, dogs arrange themselves into compromises the floor, and ovens bank their ash like savings no one will audit. The assize, that patient background hum, keeps its watch in the numbers it has posted and the habits it has taught, and will be there in the morning to do exactly the same thing again. If you like absurd specifics, there is always one more. In certain places, the price list was nailed to a church door because nothing gathers attention like announcements on wood. In others, it was read by a crier who mispronounced a number with such consistency that bakers adjusted their weights to his voice rather than the text. And everyone was happier for the compromise. Some towns kept a standard loaf next to the official weights. a petrified specimen as hard as honesty that no one dared throw away. You could knock on it and hear a sound like a moral. Children were told not to touch it, which meant they touched it with vast reverence when no one watched Dot. And then there are the crumbs, which are the retired citizens of bread. The assize says nothing about them, and yet they are the part most people ate again, transformed, soaked in ale for pottages, scattered in pans for custards, pressed into linings for pies that wanted to be trustworthy. The law draws the line at the point of sale. The kitchen takes the lime and turns it into a circle. Reuse is the polite name. The older word is thrift. Either way, the measure of the town's contentment can be heard in the scrape of a spoon along the edge of a bowl that has gone from soup to history. If your eyes are very nearly closed, you may still hear the arithmetic finishing its gentle patrol. 12 shillings the quarter, 14, 16. The penny loaf, heavier, lighter, behaving itself. A cup filled to the mark. A stamp pressed into crust. A clerk whose voice has lowered to the softness of someone speaking to shelves. The town returns to the easy order that does not demand applause. Somewhere an apprentice dreams of dropping a weight again and polishing it into a moon. Somewhere a baker dreams of loaves that all weigh exactly what they should without help from tables, and wakes to find the table waiting anyway, like a friend who likes to be asked. The assize keeps walking its slow spiral path through days, and the path is so well worn that feet can follow it in the dark. If you drift now, the last thing you notice might be no more than a small, satisfied sound, a balance settling, a lid set on a flour bin, the click of a latch that promises the bread will still be bread in the morning. You might not expect a sheet of paper to have an origin story, but somewhere a clerk sharpened a pencil, drew a rectangle, and quietly changed every office nap of the 20th century. It is the A series, the one that begins with a A, O, and keeps folding until it reaches a size that remembers being a postage stamp. The miracle, if we are being very calm about miracles, is that the rectangle keeps its shape when halved. The ratio is the square root of 2 to 1. Not 2, not 1.5, but the friendly irrational that makes copying feel like magic instead of carpentry. AO is 1 square meter. A1 is exactly half of that. A2 is half again. A4 is the letter that takes appointments, apologies, and shopping lists without complaint. A series of pieces that know what to do when you cut them, the way loaves know how to slice. If you are still awake when I reach the part about 18th century mathematicians and their dreams of tidy stationery, you can subscribe for more rectangles, or you can let your eyes fold in half like A3 becoming A4, a transformation that happens without anyone announcing it. The story drifts first through ideas rather than factories. Long before printers learned to hum, scholars noticed that having a rectangle and keeping the same shape would be useful. Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, admirer of thunder and tidy notes, wrote about such papers in the 1780s. He liked storms, electricity, and the small pleasures of formats that behave. He wrote a letter suggesting that if printers adopted this ratio, folding would be easier, binding calmer. A notebook could be born from a sheet without worrying the margins. He was right, and then everyone had tea and continued not doing it for another century and a half. Ideas are like that. They nap. In the meantime, Europe stacked papers of every temperament post. Foolscap, Demai, royal names that sound like a card game hosted by a parliament. Printers coped. Clerks developed a sixth sense for envelopes that were not in the drawer you thought. Somewhere a young articled clerk learned that foolscap is not an insult, merely a size with a sense of humor. Meanwhile, the ratio waited, leaning against the wall like a broom that knows it will be called upon when a standard at last becomes a standard. In 1922. Germany, which has a talent for the practical grace of measurements, issued DIN 476, I took Lichtenberg's quiet rectangle, gave it numbers, and let it walk into offices. The choice to make it exactly 1 square meter is the kind of decision that makes engineers breathe better. The square meter is friendly. You can weigh a ream and call it grams per square meter, GSM. Today, you can hold a page and tell its character by a number that reads like polite bragging. 80 grams per square meter is office paper that does not mind being printed on both sides. 300 is a postcard that will never droop on the fridge. A 0 at 1 square meter means not only easy calculation, it means every halving solves a story problem in advance. Drawing scale. Margins behave. When the shapes meet the light on a drafting table, they do not quarrel. It is an Excel spreadsheet turned into furniture.din 476, spread politely. War delayed its passports. After the dust, standards organizations compared notes. And in 1975, ISO 216 looked almost exactly like the German document. Because when you copy a good rectangle, you get another good rectangle. One country after another signed on. The A series joined the B and C series like cousins who always attend reunions even when invited late. The C sizes hover between A and B to serve envelopes. C4 accepts a 4 without folding. C5 greets 2A5 south or a folded A4 with the empathy of a friend who brought an extra sweater. In North America, meanwhile, letter size continued its charming insistence on being 8.5 by 11 inches, a shape with a ratio that does not keep its hat on when you fold it. Legal size trailed behind like a scarf that never quite fits a file drawer. These sizes are very dear to filing cabinets and to tradition. They persist in the way porches persist, even when someone invents central heating. But most of the world fell asleep under the A-series blanket and woke up able to send the same invoice to Oslo and Osaka without reprinting a template. A4 is the citizen we meet every day. 210 millimeters by 297. It is tall enough to look official and short enough to tuck into a bag. If paper had personality types, A4 would be the quiet friend who arrives early and helps with chairs. You can fold it in thirds for a letter, and half for a booklet, and fourths for a pocket map to the only cafe that still uses chalk. A photocopier, perhaps the last mechanical object that lives in every office lobby like a domesticated beast, is built around A4 the way a seashell is built around its inhabitant. Place in a 3-sheet on the glass, press 71%, and it descends to A4 like a polite elevator. Press 141%, and a leaf grows to A3 with the meaningful confidence of a plant that knows which way is sun. The numbers 71 and 141 are not magic. They are approximations of 1 divided by the square root of 2 and the square root of 2 itself. It is pleasant how the machine pretends to do heavy mathematics while making it sound like a distant rainstorm dot. The joy of the A-series is that it lets a piece of information travel through sizes without losing its shoes. A poster starts as a O, a map you can picnic upon. It becomes a 1 for a wall, a 2 for a window, a 3 for a notice board that thinks big, a 4 for a handout, a 5 for the fridge, a 6 for a pocket. You never redesign, you just fold or photograph. A typography teacher once told students to design at AO and walk down the stairs, noticing which letters begin to squint and which grits complain. There is grace in watching a poem survive a shrinking migration without begging for a rewrite. Bookbinders understood immediately. Fold a 2 to a 3, then to a 4, cut a curled spine, sew signatures, and you have a book that knows where its siblings are in the nest. The ratio is a lullaby for printers. They hum it while the ink dries, economies like rectangles that don't argue. A 0 being 1 square meter means prices of paper, which used to sound mysterious, now behave. A printer quotes costs by square meter, not by superstition. An architect orders plans in A1 without inventing a unit no one else uses. A student buys a pad of A3 and does not need to translate its ambition at the store. In packaging, cartons are designed to accept A-series stacks without the sly margins that waste space like a chatty guest. A palette understands reams because the reams understand themselves. In stationery shops, the universe arranges itself by exponent. An aisle of A4, like a row of sleepers breathing in time. Another of A5, smaller in the way afternoon is smaller than morning. A shelf of A3, which always feels like a day off. Of course, there are oddities. B-series exists, larger by a factor of square root of 2 than the corresponding A size. It is used for posters and passports in ways that seem ceremonial, as if the state wishes to remind us that it can choose unreasonably large or unreasonably small rectangles at will. C-series for envelopes sits between them like a mediator who brings biscuits. And somewhere in a back office, a very tired person has accidentally printed a 4 landscape when they needed a 3 portrait and wonders briefly about career changes. The A-series forgives easily. You fold, you staple, you promise to check the preferences next time. The paper holds a crease like a gentle reminder. There are histories hiding in margins. During the paper shortages of the 1940s, governments issued guidelines on how to trim the white. A4 pages narrowed their generous shoulders. The margins came back later the way fashions do. In cold offices where typewriters hit the ribbons with a force that comforted no one, secretaries who knew how to make a carbon copy also knew how to coax a page count into the budget by adding or subtracting lines within the rules of the ratio. An entire art developed around folding a 4 into a secret pocket that could carry a bus ticket, a coin, and a promise to bring bread. No one patented it. Everyone's grandmother already knew. In classrooms, children turn a 4 into boats, hats, and birds. The hat fits for a moment and then learns humility. The boat sails once across a sink with the solemnity of a ceremony, and then forgets it was once a tree. Printers live in the details. There's a quiet satisfaction in ordering 500 sheets of A4 at 90 GSM and knowing they will be exactly that. Not approximately, not an attitude, but a number you can greet with a handshake. The stack arrives wrapped in paper that softly shouts the mill's name. You open it with a feeling strangely similar to opening flour. You think, today we will bake documents. A laser printer attracts the loose fibers with a small storm of static. The toner melts into letters that will survive a light rain and a firm paper clip. If you hold the page to your ear, you can hear a tiny whisper of heat leaving. The sheet cools with a characteristically modest sigh dot. Meanwhile, in other corners of the world, letter size continues like an old melody. 8.5 by 11. Printers learn to dance with both. Software provides drop-down menus, a peculiar alter to dimensions. You select A4 and feel continental. You select letter and feel resolute. The difference is small enough to be funny, large enough to produce a moment where a footer vanishes like a shy animal. People develop template rituals to keep the footer tame. They name files with the suffix A4 or letter as if the pages are aircraft that need the correct runway. No one minds. The S-series is not a tyrant. It assumes coexistence. Its gift is not dominance, but predictability for those who accept it. At the heart of all this fuss is the ratio, the square root of 2, a number that refuses to be either tidy or melodramatic. It was known to Babylonian mathematicians around 1800 BCE, who approximated it with sexagesimal grace. It visited the Greeks, scandalized Pythagoreans by being irrational, then settled down, as all celebrities must, into a career as a laminate for paper and a whisper behind photography. The ratio is perfect for a leaf because it doubles and halves without changing its self-esteem. A series can grow toward posters or shrink toward tickets without losing its accent. If rectangles had passports, A and its cousins would cross borders with a stamp that simply says square root 2, and border officers would wave them through for being obviously themselves. There is a soft humor in the ways the standard meets everyday life. A copier says paper jam and tray 2, which is untrue in the same way a polite person says we must do lunch. There's no jam. There is only a slightly curled A4 that tried to become a 3 in a moment of ambition. A teacher instructs a class to submit assignments on a 4 with margins of 2 centimeters, and students everywhere copy the same paragraph into the exact rectangle and print with the hum of a single subject storm. A bureaucrat discovers that making the Form A3 solved a problem because people suddenly filled it in legibly out of respect for breadth. A busker designs flyers on a 6 because they fit into hands without scaring dogs. Small mercies, all certified by a committee that once drank coffee and argued pleasantly about millimeters. The committee itself is a soothing image. Engineers and typographers around a table, measuring with rulers that have never once been used as swords. Someone clears a throat and says, "Shall we confirm that AO is 1 square meter?" Heads nod. Someone else suggests that rounding to whole millimeters for common sizes will save printers from decimals, the way well-fitted shoes save walkers from blisters. A vote is held. The result is unanimous except for a distinguished gentleman who abstains on principle because he dislikes the letter C but can offer no better alternative. Minutes are recorded. They become part of the vast, polite archive of specifications where standards live and nap and wait to be looked up on a Tuesday. Designers amuse themselves within the rectangle by drawing invisible grids. A 4 divides neatly into columns that comfort text like armchairs. Leading and type size fall into civil relationships. Posters at a one place photographs with the confident ease of someone arranging furniture in a room whose walls meet at right angles you can trust. Calendars just work. There's a reason so many planners fit in so many bags. The ratio removes decision fatigue in the same way a well-planned pantry removes hunger panic. You put things where they make sense, and everything looks competent without trying. A gifted printer once told me that the beauty of standards is that no one notices them until they fail. The S-series is the opposite of a drama queen. It has a resting face that says, "I'm here." Even museums are not immune. In storage rooms, works on paper are matted to sizes that echo A. Mounts and boxes nest with the tidiness of spoon sets. Conservators adore predictable borders. It means less trimming, fewer custom orders, more time for the slow joy of mending a rip with Japanese tissue that makes a soft sound under a brush. Archives cut mylar sleeves to a 4 and sleep a little better about fingerprints. A palimpsest of bureaucracy sits behind every poem we love and every notice we ignore. The rectangle holds them both with the same, almost parental patience. At home, the standard becomes domestic. Lists and recipes all learn to live in a 5 notebooks that open flat and do not fight the left hand. Children fold a 4 into airplanes whose aerodynamics are haunted by the rectangle's ancestry. The classic dart uses the long edges with a seriousness you can admire. The tumbling bat, a plane of loops, says ratio in a dialect no one studies. On kitchen tables, bills arrive in C5 envelopes and become piles of a 4 that will eventually be made smaller by a shredder, which is the rare device that declares war on rectangles and is still invited to the party. Birth certificates, diplomas, instructions for assembling beds all appear in sizes that reassure the eye. Even the magnets on the fridge know their territory. There is also the odd, kindly tyranny of the ring binder. 2 or 4 holes spaced just so. The A4 page accepts the corn procedure with stoicism. It does not tear easily because the GSM was chosen with holes in mind. The binder swallows a year of life and stands at attention on the shelf that begins to look like a row of little buildings. Somewhere a student slides in a 3-sheet folded to a 4 into a sleeve and feels the small triumph of fitting a big idea into a standard pocket. You can almost hear the paper whisper, "There, there," as the zipper closes. If you ask why it matters, the answer is that sleep loves predictability. When the world agrees on the size of a sheet, many little frictions evaporate. Printers run faster. Staff meetings end sooner, or at least they end on smaller sheets. Photocopiers copy without sighing. Envelopes do not ask questions. Packages stack like well-behaved clouds. People can argue about fonts and margins because the foundation is decided. It is a social contract written in millimeters, which is to say, it is boring in the best possible way. Like road markings, it keeps us in lanes without telling us where to go. The square root of 2 keeps returning, like a number that meant to say goodbye but remembered another anecdote. It appears in photography in sensor sizes, in aspect ratios that tried on different suits in the 20th century and settled on a few that flattered them. It appears in crop marks, those polite little L's that tell a guillotine where to breathe. A printing house at 2 in the morning is full of those LS glow tape, ink, and people who can measure 7 millimeters by eye after 3 coffees. They will tell you it is not glamorous, and then, if you ask nicely, they will show you the perfect stack of a 4 that came off the cutter, like a freshly tiled floor. Night falls on a quiet office. Desks snap under screens who have said their piece. A last document curls softly in the meow tray. The paper remembers being a tree, yes, but also remembers being geometry. It lies there with margins that reflect choices made in a meeting you were not invited to and are grateful to have missed. The standard leans against everything invisible. If you listen closely, you can hear the faintest slap of a fresh ream settling on a shelf, the whisper of a ruler taking one more measure for the road, the small content exhale of a page that knows it will fit any envelope someone has at hand. The rectangle does not need to be thanked. It is content to be put away, to be folded into thirds, to be passed under a door, to be recycled into another rectangle that will remember the same ratio without ever bragging. And if you are nearly asleep now, you might picture AO, a square meter of promise, having itself again and again until it becomes a 4, then a 5. Then a note with 2 words, "Good night," written in a hand that fits inside the margins without even trying. You might not think that a feather has a to-do list, but a goose quill wakes up with one: grow straight, collect keratin, attend to barbs, wait for a particular week in summer, and eventually retire into a pen that will sign groceries and kingdoms with equal indifference. The quill pen is not dramatic the way swords are, nor quick the way telegraphs were. It is the sort of technology that wears slippers. It turns noise into scratch lines and believes, very sincerely, in the power of a good trim. If you're still awake in a few minutes, after we have met the goose, the penknife, and a jar of powdered cuttlefish bone that answers to the name Pounce, feel free to subscribe for more histories where nothing explodes. Or don't. I will be right here, whittling a nib that does not mind being ignored. A quill began as a promise on a bird. Not just any feather. The primary flight feathers, usually numbers 3 to 7, had the right stiffness and a hollow shaft like a tiny lung. Scribes preferred the left wing for left-handed curvature and the right wing for right-handed writers. So the nib's gentle bend agreed with the hand and the paper, like a handshake that understands elbows. Best quills came from geese raised near cold water. The chill toughened the keratin the way a brisk walk fortifies opinions. Molting season and late summer supplied feathers already thinking about retirement. There were rituals. The quills were sorted by length like polite soldiers, then seasoned, which is not cooking but patience. Bundles stood near a fire to warm their temper, or were briefly dipped in hot sand to drive out oils. Some makers slid them into a faintly sour bath alum and water to coax stiffness. Then they dried in bunches, upside down, looking like a choir of skinny umbrellas at ease. The penknife comes in like a small, courteous hero. The word still rides along in pockets, though it now opens packages and the occasional apple. Originally, it was for pens quills that needed shaping every few pages. A scribe would sit with a few prepared quills in a cup, and one in hand, and the penknife between them like a marriage counselor. The process is tidy, almost fussy. First, the feather barbs are trimmed away because the quill is changing careers and no longer needs to fly. The barrel is cut at a bias, a shallow slice that introduces the future. Then the tip is slid along the grain, just a few millimeters, creating the flexible tongue that spreads with pressure and delivers ink in a dignified way. Shoulders are shaved to control that spread. The nib is squared against a pumice stone. A final scrape smooths the inner channel where ink will travel like a commuter who knows which door opens at which station. Every step makes a subtle rasping sound, the whisper of keratin in conversation with steel. The quill is born twice, once on the wing and once on the desk. The desk itself is an ecosystem that lives in quiet weather. You would see a pen rest a grooved bit of wood or porcelain that keeps the newly dipped point from marking the table with little moons. There's a sand shaker, sometimes called a sander or pounce pot. There is pounce, which has the energy of fairy dust, but the pragmatism of kitchen salt. It is powdered cuttlefish bone or powdered pumice, or sometimes starch. It prepares the page by giving just a hint of tooth, reminds the ink to settle where it lands, and dries the wet letters like a towel designed by geology. The shaker has holes that suggest a pepper mill that enrolled in finishing school. A gentle shake leaves a pale snowfall, and a gentle tilt returns most of it to the pot, the remainder clinging like applause. There is also blotting paper in later centuries unsized paper that acts like a thirsty cousin, taking the extra without drama. Before that, writers lifted the wet shine with a rectangle of fine sand sprinkled and then poured off, which turns out to be one of the more satisfying. Small chores of history.ink arrives in this scene with a personality borrowed from weather. Iron gall ink was the workhorse, oak galls crushed for tannins, vitriol for iron, gum, Arabic to keep everything together as team players, and water to convince them all to act like ink. Freshly made, it is a grayish liquid with dreams of blackness. On paper, it darkens as air makes a quiet bargain with iron, an oxidation that continues for years, like a sentence that has not yet decided where to end. It bites a little into paper fibers, which is why manuscripts written with it survive damp centuries, with text still stubborn and legible. Soot-based inks lamp black, mixed with gum sat more politely on the surface and smiled for artists who wanted washes and soft edges. A quill can be dipped into either and does not argue, though it prefers the properly strained kind, so clots do not surprise the words. The act of writing with a quill has a gait to it. You dip. The tip swims for a second, long enough that the ink recognizes the channel inside the nib and climbs a few millimeters by capillary optimism. You lift, tap once, maybe twice, on the lip of the inkwell. The first stroke is bold. The next 6 enjoy the memory. The 9th is a reminder to visit the well again. A rhythm develops. Dip, dap, draw, breathe, sand, shake, tilt, continue. It is slow in the way walking is slow fast enough to get somewhere, but always aware of the scenery. The nib spreads under pressure and returns to a line when the hand relaxes, giving thick and thin strokes their gentle conversation. Italic hands, chancery, secretary script all developed because the nib insisted on decorating certain directions with grace. The visual rhythm is called contrast. The practical result is that even shopping lists look faintly important. Dill, vinegar, candles. A new kettle, everything inherits a little opera dot, There are the small accommodations a quill requires. Paper needs sizing, a thin layer of gelatin or starch brushed across during manufacture, so the fibers welcome ink without behaving like a sponge auditioning for praise. A writer who runs out of sized paper can polish a sheet with the heel of the hand, or tap pounce like a tiny snowball, or both, and then carry on, because words seldom wait for paper to be perfect. The nib needs frequent resharpening. The edge has all the endurance of a dinner roll. Scribes learn to turn the knife toward themselves and shave with calm, controlled pulls, smoothing the inner slit with a narrow blade, like a barber attending to punctuation. The feather end, if left on, tickles the back of a hand and announces itself in the flourishes. So many people trimmed it close or removed it entirely. Portraits often leave the barbs on because a naked shaft looks less festive, but working quills usually present the practical minimalism of a chalk stick, some facts that refuse to be louder than they are. Porcupine quills make poor writing tools because their barbs encourage every wrong idea about smoothness. Swan quills were prestigious and larger, good for bold hands and ceremonial signatures that needed to be seen from across a table. Crow quills, very fine, later gave draftsmen the hair-thin lines that machinery loves. A quill can be hardened by sand, by ash, by heated metal gently applied, by patience. In winter, ink is grumpy. People warmed the inkwell near a candle until it remembered fluidity. A quill does not like writing against the growth of the paper. Move uphill, and it grates. Move downhill with the grain, and it purrs. Scribes learn their sheets the way sailors learn winds, by feel, with tiny coarse corrections that appear as elegance. What is now a metaphor, sharpening one's wits, was once literal. The penknife sat between thought and paper and regularly asked for attention. Classrooms in the 18th century sounded like soft birds and sharp stones, a chorus of scratching interrupted by quick chiffs of steel. The floor collected curls of keratin that would have startled a vacuum cleaner into existential reflection. In many schoolbooks of the period, margins are decorated with pen trials. Those little fences of strokes and X's where a child tested a nib before returning to Latin verbs. Adults did the same. Scholars leave trails of pen trials across Europe, thin ladders of lines. Attempts at a letter, a flourish abandoned. The calligraphic equivalent of clearing one's throat. Printers inherited the quill's habits and then replaced them. Metal nibs emerged in the 19th century, manufactured in Birmingham in numbers that suggest an enthusiastic anthill. Steel nibs are quarrelsome at first. They bite, they scratch, they want the right angle, but then they learn to be reliable. Millions could be stamped, slit, and boxed like cookies. They lasted longer than quills, though they lost the romance of whittling and the faint drift of feather barbs across the desk. Still, the vocabulary stayed. We kept nib, we kept penknife, we kept the action to pen, which is funny because now so many pens do not require knives, and yet the word refuses to go anywhere. Language is loyal to the hands that fed it. Blotting paper deserves a little more attention than it ever receives. It appeared in the 18th century, more or less, by accident on sized paper that turned out to be wonderfully thirsty. People cut it into rectangles that fit inside writing cases, stitched it into portfolios, and pressed it onto the shimmer of wet ink with the solemnity of a blessing. There were rocker blotters, too, wooden cradles holding sheets of blotter, curved so you could roll them across a page as if calming a restless cat. Red blotting paper became common, though no one truly agrees why red. It may have hidden stains. It may have been cheerful. It may have been the dye that was on hand. Regardless, a desk with a red blotter looks like it has dressed itself, and letters written atop it seem to stand in better posture. Pounce stepped back as blotting paper advanced, but it stayed in love with rough paper and repair jobs. A scribe who spilled a droplet could sometimes save the page by a quick pinch of pounce and a gasp. Powdered cuttlefish bone is light, made from the inner architecture of a mollusk that spends its life floating with enviable grace. When it finally arrives on the desk, the cuttlefish has retired into usefulness. There is a small peace to be had in knowing that one animal's buoyancy becomes another person's legible sentence. The quill fashioned by hand made the hand itself more noticeable. Scripts changed with nibs and with fashion. Narrow, upright hands spoke of bookkeeping and habit. Broad italics swung with the wrist. Copperplate, a later concoction of pointed nib and disciplined loops, could have been designed by someone who enjoyed both lace and arithmetic. Quill-made letters often carry a small roughness, right? Where the nib meets the page after a dip, the first downstroke wider because the tines are happy. That little fat note in a letter form is a signature of the process. It is, in its way, a fingerprint of a moment. The ink was fresh, the hand was sure. The sand shaker weighted dot geography, too, made quill culture slightly different from place to place. In monastic scriptoria, quills were tools to domesticate holy words. A monk might prepare a dozen on Sunday evening like a shepherd counting sheep, so that Monday's psalms would not be interrupted by carpentry. In Ottoman chancelleries, reed pens ruled with their wider, more architectural strokes, and the cut was different, but the rhythm was the same: dip, draw, pause, admire. In colonial offices, quills drafted maps that were too clean for the mud they described. In households, the corner chair by the window served as a desk, because light is the ink's first cousin. People sat there with quill and paper and proposed marriages, investments and recipes with equal gravity. The quill knew how to retire. When worn down to a reluctant step, it could become a tool for scraping errors, gently raking dried ink from parchment, a kind of eraser that asks questions. Or it could sign its last name on a modest note and rest in the cup, proud to have outlived several grocery lists and a poem. Children claimed old quills for games, writing secret alphabets with them in lemon juice, which later revealed words when heated by a candle, as if the quills still kept a pocket of fire. Gardeners used them as labels, their hollow shafts welcoming a stick. Nothing wastes more elegantly than a feather. One meets small absurdities along the way. There were quill cutters' little brass devices that claimed to standardize nibs. They worked if you admired uniform mediocrity. There were pen wipes, squares of wool, or velvet that kept sleeves clean and discovered new career paths as lint sources. There were traveling inkwells that closed like pillboxes, faithful companions of bad roads and long waits at toll gates. There were rules about how far to dip: not past the slit, do not drown the pen, do not baptize it in enthusiasm. There were superstitions: do not leave a quill pointing at a door. It invites letters to arrive more quickly. Most offices ignored these and continued receiving mail at the speed of horses. If you look for the quill's remains today, you find them in idioms and in drawers. The penknife is still here, sharpening pencils now, which are quietly jealous that quills had their own dedicated blade. Calligraphers coax feathers back to life for pleasure. Museums keep a few in cases pale, with tips that still remember the geometry of sentences. One or two somehow found their way into keepsake boxes that also hold a ribbon, a coin, and a photograph with a crease. Pick one up, and it is lighter than its reputation. Put it to paper with even a little ink, and it remembers everything at once. The scrape returns, the line thickens when you lean into it, the thought slows until it matches the speed of the nib. If this were a technological review, the quill would get 5 stars for elegance and 2 for convenience. And people would still buy it because it invites better posture in the mind. Sometimes an entire nation pauses because of a pen. Treaties wait for the correct feather, trimmed for spectacle, to touch a page the way a ship waits for a bottle to break. The feather is there for the photograph, a relic of seriousness, but the signature itself is just a guided river of iron gall. Generals and statesmen, who might have thrown many sterling objects in their lives, sit very carefully and remember that pressure spreads the tines and a blot is not history's preferred footnote. The quill insists on civility at the last possible moment. There is a bedtime gentleness to the way. The old desk settles when the writing is done. Sand is poured back. The rocking blotter rocks once for the joy of it. The penknife folds. The inkwell lid closes with a tinny kiss. The quill rests on the groove and pretends to be decor. If you tilt your head, you can almost hear centuries of diaries exhaling pages that woke before dawn to catch farm weather. Letters that crossed oceans tucked in the captain's chest. Notes that organized coal deliveries and Sunday cakes. Drafts that smudged when a hand paused to think. The quill is among the least dramatic engines to have moved the world, and maybe the most COMPANIONABLE. It teaches, in a small way, how thought can adopt a pace. You cannot hurry a feather into algebra any more than you can hurry tea into flavor. Words arrive at the speed of the next dip. The nib asks for a gentle angle. The paper asks for a kind touch. The sentence asks not to trip. None of this is urgent. All of it is binding. There is, tucked inside every quill-shaped silence, the suggestion that we do not need to be efficient to be exact. You write, and the letter tells you what it wanted to be all along. You fix a split with the knife. You add a breath of pounce. You continue. A paragraph finishes itself almost of its own accord, like a flock turning together without a meeting. We could go on, late into the night, about quill holders and desks with secret compartments, about the way left-handers negotiated slanted writing boards with bravery, about the chemistry of ink that browned over centuries into caramel letters. We could list curious facts. No, porcupine quills did not sign constitutions. Yes, goose pens can last a day if you behave. No, the feathers on the nib end are not for show. Yes, sailors wrote in cramped bunks and the ship added its own commas. But every additional fact sounds like the same whisper repeated. A feather cut the right way produced a line, and the line produced a life dot so the evening slows. The shaker is full, the inkwell is clean, the penknife sleeps. Somewhere a goose stands beside dark water, preens, and ignores all this literature entirely. On the desk, the quill waits with the patience of a lamp that has never complained about being turned down. If you are still awake, you can imagine the next dip, the next fat downstroke, the next tidy shake of pounce. Or you can let your thoughts go soft and feathery, each one a small white tool that once knew the sky, settling into the margin where the paper is warm and the sentence does not mind if it never quite ends. You might not expect a baked circle of dirt to be the most stubborn conversation partner in the Aegean, but there it is, the Phaistos disc, warming under a museum lamp like a biscuit with secrets. Somewhere, a brush lifts dust that has been asleep longer than grammar. A soft tap of wood against clay echoes once, twice, as if a stamp is practicing lines for a quiet play. If you're still awake by the time I reach the bit about powdered clay and how fast the spiral unwinds, you can subscribe for more bedtime archaeology. But truly, don't exert yourself. This disc has waited 36 centuries. It will not mind another nap. Imagine the storeroom late. Lamps lean into their own halos. On a shelf sits a palm-sized circle, about as thick as a thumb laid sideways. Light as bread, firm as a tile that learned manners. It lies among ordinary sherds who have stopped trying to impress anyone. The surface carries a spiral road, lane upon lane, edged by low ridges that make you think a careful finger once guided wet earth like icing. A curator notes a number in a booklet with clean margins because every mystery deserves at least one reference. Someone turns the disc over. It has two faces, the way coins do in certain kinds of gossip. The spiral runs on both. stepping inward like a guest who is not quite sure when to stop walking. The signs on it look made, not drawn, repeated, and identical, like footprints that share a shoe. This is the first yawn of the riddle. Each mark is crisp, as if a tiny stamp pressed into damp clay, lifted and pressed again, like a patient person using a tiny pastry cutter on eternity. The disc says nothing about why. It sits in its neat palm-sized silence and forgets to apologize. A day's work in stamps, that is what it resembles. Not a monument, not a proclamation, just a session at a small table with a damp puck of clay and a shallow tray of carved tokens that keep wanting to be in rows. You can picture the maker correcting the pace, because impressions overlap in places where a hand needed to breathe. The edges of the signs sometimes show where the tool landed a fraction off and then found its seat, a micro choreography of lift and set, more patient than any pen. It was not carved with a stylus point. It was stamped, each image drawn once, then repeated, like a typeface that never imagined newspapers, only a single spiral conversation. The day must have been kind to the kill. One worker, one clay body, one firing, long enough to be deliberate and short enough to be ordinary. A potter could have lent space in a firing, slotted the disc among bowls, and decided not to brag about it at dinner. That is the sort of humility objects practice for us. Once you notice the stamps, you begin counting them, because humans cannot resist telling catalogs. There are 45 little pictures if you are the sort of person who trusts lists, and each returns with the predictability of a favorite tune. A plumed head with a profile that never ages. A shield that is either square or very tired. A lily that refuses to wilt. A boat that does not plan to sail. A comb, a fish, a hide, a bee that sits, still considering nectar that is entirely hypothetical. Groupings fall into small clusters separated by tiny marks like breath ticks. Longer stretches behave like lines, as if someone has arranged phrases that know how to end. Those who count syllables point happily and call the clusters feet of a verse. Those who count things point happily and call them whole words. Those who stage performances point happily and call them stage directions, because if you are determined, any set of symbols will remember theater for you. The pattern promises grammar, then refuses to name its language. The way a polite stranger nods at you from the bus and never says hello. Direction is a question with this disc. Do you begin at the rim and travel inward, like a pilgrim with admirable focus? Or do you start at the center and spiral outward, like a rumor that gains confidence by running downhill? Read it clockwise and the joins meet cleanly. Read it counterclockwise and certain overlaps look less offended. Around and around, you can persuade yourself of both, and the disc tolerates your certainty with historical patience. If it is text, there must be a missing voice. If it is ritual, there must be a missing room. In one corner of our imagination stands a reader who knows when to turn, who hums along to the ticks like a chorus leader. Scholars have stood where that person might have stood, and have discovered that being right about such artifacts is exactly as comfortable as wearing a hat made of fog. The disc does not mind. It is, for once, an object completely content to be read wrongly forever. Theories march in with the softness of slippers. Say some. You can almost hear the line's 14 symbols tick, 10 symbols tick. A refrain that comes back like a friend at the door. Calendar, say others, plant Lilith on the third boat. Sacrifice a rooster whenever the shield appears. Take the square shield as a reminder to square accounts. Board game, say a few who smile. Imagine beans moving along the spiral like a very slow race that refuses to choose a winner. Island guide, say lovers of practical writing. Turn left at the plumed head would be an excellent instruction if the island would stand still long enough to be mapped in clay. Prayers glow, of course they do, but skip the breaks, as all fine prayers do when their feet forget how long they have been walking. Beautiful ideas polish up quickly, but then a small fracture appears. The counts are off. The stamps are misaligned where they ought not be. The dashes forget to be regular just when your theory asks them politely. Good proposals fold themselves neatly and go back in the drawer where the disc lets you keep them unbroken, because it likes minds tidy even when it dislikes decisions. And then there is the suspicion that every museum learns to brew like very weak tea. Perhaps it is a fake. It would be neat if it were recent, how clever the carver, how naive the catalog. But the clay interrupts that tidy ending. Its fabric, the noise inside it, the tiny mineral fingerprints, the firing temperature that lives in its core like a remembered weather report, all point to Bronze Age heat and not to a studio trick staged in an age of cameras. The tool marks, too, show a kit of stamps worn in ways that would be hard to fake without the long impatience that produced them. The lab light finds corrections, not performance. It finds a place where the stamp slid slightly and someone smoothed the clay with a damp edge, not because an audience watched, but because habit watched. Field notes add their own drowsy insistence by placing the disc where the dust says it lay. The verdict stays careful, unlikely to be modern, unproven to be anything else, which is to say, it remains itself, a perfectly reasonable citizen of uncertainty. Science tries its gentlest tricks. Raking light rakes softly, and shallow ridges stand up like polite hands in a classroom. Reflectance transformation imaging, a name that sounds like a lullaby for pixels, stacks many photographs into one, pliable view, and lets the signs appear and reappear, as if the hand that made them had left a hinge in the clay. The pause between two impressions becomes a visible gap, a thought caught mid-press. You can almost hear a breath being taken 4,000 years ago, which is perhaps the only thing one should ever hear clearly across that valley. Tiny chips, almost shy, show drying began along a certain arc. Someone had stepped away and returned in an afternoon that once had weather. The disc, which is silent in every other registry, remembers being made the way bread remembers the shape of the bowl. It is not speech, but surface memory, which is comfortable to listen to in the dark. If it is writing, someone once read it aloud and stopped at the ticks for breath, and maybe nodded to an audience that already knew the refrain. If it is ritual, a leader followed the spiral while a circle answered in steps. Left, right, around and in and around and in, until the center offered that small stationary prize that all spirals promise and never describe. If it is neither, it remains a coin that never paid for anything, a game board that forgot its beans, a prayer wheel that whispers only to dust. It is quite literally a perfect device for thinking order you can hold, meaning you cannot. Night is an excellent time for such objects. The lamp makes the relief plainer. The eye becomes patient. The mind gives up on final answers with a sense of relief that feels a lot like sleep-hanging ideas to dry dot picture the table on the day it was made. A potter's smell of wet clay. The damp heft of a fresh disc that wants edges. A tray of stamps, each cut from olive wood or bone, each with a picture so tidy you could find it by touch. The worker dips one into water to keep clay from clinging too hard. Presses, lifts, presses, moving along the spiral like a needle that refuses to be thread. Somewhere a fly tests the concept of immortality by walking across wet signs. The maker wipes it away with a thumb and leaves a ridge so small it will be discussed in a footnote centuries later. The spiral tightens. The center arrives sooner than you expect. It always does. The disc is set aside. Later, a fire seals it. The fire makes no comments. It never does. Centuries stumble past. The object is nothing more than a firm idea in a ruin. People step over it. A wall falls. A rim learns the sky. A shard kisses another shard in the sort of polite collision that archaeology depends on. Someone with a hat brushes dust and sees a circle and thinks, oh, a lid, and then notices the neat, fussy little pictures that carry themselves too proudly to be purely decorative. A notebook opens. The disc receives a number, which is how museums say hello. It travels a short distance counterintuitive to common sense and a very long distance according to time. It acquires a label, which is a lovely compromise between confession and hope, undeciphered. The label stays the same while the font is updated. Even undeciphered things have habits. The spiral organizes thought, chases you into the middle, and refuses to let you out where you began, like a conversation that insists on a different door. The repeatable signs look like alphabet, but they behave like syllables, clicking into clusters that behave like words. Except when they don't. You learn its cadence, and then it leans the other way. A person could spend some very pleasant months pretending to translate it. Bring the Lila at dawn. Count 8 shields. The boat goes where the bee points. It is, I assure you, a good way to avoid answering emails. If you consider copies, imagination keeps its elbows in. What else was stamped? The stamps were reusable. That is the point of stamps. Were there other discs? If yes, they have not introduced themselves. Did the stamps live in a box with a lid that stuck in summer? Were there sets, religious set, administrative set, storytelling set with the lily and the boat switching careers depending on the company they kept? It would be handy if a second disc appeared with a sudden desire to be helpful, the way twins in comedies save plots that have lost their shoes. For now, there is one, which is the right number for bedtime. On paper, the disc is drawn again and again, transcriptions that imitate the small emphases of the stamps, fonts that turn the 45 pictures into squares of digital obedience, posters that promise mystery and really deliver typography. Each rendering is a kindness to future study and a small betrayal of the original's warmth. Clay keeps its tiny wrinkles, like skin that remembers every smile. Paper loses them, screens lose them faster. Only the lamp keeps faith. The life of ideas around the disc has interesting furniture. A scholar proposes a decipherment and places it in a journal with footnotes aligned like soldiers with clean boots. Another scholar politely points out that certain breaks in the spiral do not respect those feet. A third scholar, who has slept well, suggests we admire the object more slowly. Meanwhile, the disc sits, pleased to be famous, unbothered by being misunderstood, rather like a cat in a museum courtyard who has discovered that becoming a mascot requires only stillness. Even the forged theories, those speculative extravagances that show up with a handshake too firm, serve a purpose. They keep the conversation warm enough for the careful work to continue, like coals that make no light but hold a future flame in their mathematics. A detail I like, and perhaps you will too. The stamps show varying degrees of wear. Some are crisp. Some have edges that soften into the clay as if they are tired of being themselves. This is the familiar fatigue of tools, visible in the notch of a carpenter's chisel and the shine on a baker's bench. It says that the kit was not invented for one ceremonial hour. It lived in a life that made things regularly. The disc could be a special project built from ordinary means, the way a wedding cake uses flour that on other days makes bread, not spectacle. There's comfort in that. Mystery, yes, but also routine. The maker may have complained about a sore back and compared stamps like gardeners compare trowels. Mystery shares a wall with errands, if you need a micro-absurdity to carry with you toward sleep. Try the thought that the disc might be an ancient draft, someone testing stamps to check spacing, discovering that a spiral fits more signs than a row, and then forgetting to throw the test away because it fired nicely. In modern terms, this is the first recorded instance of a sticky note being promoted to scripture by accident. Or let yourself enjoy the opposite. The disc is the polished copy. The draft was kept on a humble tablet that went back into the bucket and is now indistinguishable from every mud cloud that ever tried to be an artifact. We circle back to light because light is how the disc agrees to show us anything at all. Tilt it and the relief shifts. A boat wakes, a shield dozes. Raking light makes each ridge cast a thread of shadow like the thinnest handwriting. Digital tricks do the same with patience and better posture. Altogether, they whisper the same conclusion. The object remembers touch. Where the hand pressed more firmly, the clay rose just enough to brag about it. Where the hand hesitated, the gap between signs opens like a window someone forgot to close. The disc has no interest in meaning as such. It has a great deal of interest in sequence. It is a diagram of doing, not of saying. This is the part where the narrator is supposed to gather threads and gesture toward resolution. But the disc does not want that. It wants to be exactly what it is, a road inward that ends where the clay decided. You can stand at the case and let your eyes walk the path, once, twice, as many times as the guard will kindly allow. You can make your own ticks pause here, breathe here, hum here. The center is a small resting place, a circular sigh. The outside rim waits patiently for you to begin again, because spirals always offer that kind invitation. Nothing collapses. Nothing demands applause. It is the most courteous puzzle, a perfect bedtime companion. So let it be evening in the storeroom again. Let the brush lift dust from old certainties. Let the lamp warm the clay until the little signs decide to sit up for a moment and show their edges. Think of the stamps returning to their tray, the firebank going cool, the killstones radiating a day that has become part of geology. Imagine a reader who knew how to turn at the right place, not because the disc said so, but because the room did. Picture that breath. Keep it. The museum closes its doors. The number in the booklet does its quiet work. The spiral waits without a schedule. If you are still with me, you could follow it once more, slowly, like a thought taking a walk and forgetting to come home. Or you could set the disc gently on the shelf of your mind, where a soft, patient mystery glows like a nightlight, and everything around it, words, footsteps. The last pages of the day settles into the kind of calm that does not mind if nothing is solved, only seen.